Hey, legends! It's your boy Chronos, and we're back with part 4 of What If Deku Had Energy Absorption Quirk. The story's getting more intense, and I can't wait to share what's next with you. Massive shout out to Big Teddy G3498, the genius behind this epic collab. Thanks for making this journey so amazing. And to all my legends out there, your support means the world to me. Let's not waste any time. Let's jump right into it. Chapter 22, Rise and Fall of Titans. Izuku boarded the bus with Bakugo and rode in silence to their arena. He didn't have to read his notes on All Might, he already knew them front to back. His plan was simple: beat All Might into surrender with raw power. He wanted to make him say, "I surrender," just for pride's sake. He could see All Might glance at the two through the rearview mirror, but Izuku paid no mind to him or Bakugo, who turned to him a few times. They arrived at a mock city and they got off. All Might paused to say some words of encouragement, but Izuku ignored him and walked past the number 1 hero to see where he will be fighting. Right then, good luck. Izuku felt the breeze of All Might leaping away and saw him land straight across from them. Izuku began to stretch and moved around freely without his jacket. He had given it to Toru to the wolf whistles of his friends and them pretending not to watch. Toru blushed heavily at their actions but beamed up at Izuku and wished him good luck. Her good luck was 1,000 times luckier than All Might's. He smiled to himself at the thought. He sensed Bakugo try to approach Izuku but stopped at a distance. "What is your plan?" Bakugo finally asked. Izuku didn't turn around. "To make him surrender." "Start," the automatic voice said, and Izuku launched himself upwards in time to see the whole main street be blown away by the number 1 hero. He was so high up that he could see all of the mock city without turning his eyes. He began to blast himself at the speck that is Izuku's target. For the moment, he enjoyed the free fall and the peace of weightlessness. Then he blasted forward at All Might. First, he took out all of his ball bearings and shot them at the hero. They broke the sound barrier and plumes of dust rocketed up from where they missed or sparks where they hit their intended target. With his face covered, he didn't see Izuku launch the lightning bolt at the weak spot on All Might's side. He coughed up blood and staggered to the side while holding where his old injury was. He looked up at the boy who landed and his eyes were cold and calculating. "Wire dash." That's all he got out as he saw Izuku rocket towards him faster than he could imagine. All Might moved, dodged the strike to his abdomen and struck back at the boy. His fist collided with the boy's shoulder and stopped dead. Izuku backhanded his still outstretched arm and a massive kinetic force made him spin away. He stopped himself and stared at the boy. "Fine then. Time to show you what it means to be the dash." He was cut off again by a lightning bolt to his weak spot. He glared at the boy and launched forward. Instead of punching, he grappled the boy who tried to get away. He was too slow and All Might caught him and brought him into a bear hug. The gang of friends watched and winced just as Izuku was held by All Might. Their classmates looked at them. "What?" Ojiro asked them. Mina pointed at the screen. "Izuku can release energy from anywhere on his body." Izuku absorbed all the sound in the immediate area and then blasted directly into the hero's face. All Might reeled back in pain and held his ears. Blood seeped out of his hands, but he didn't have time to brace as Izuku struck to the side of All Might and launched him through a building and a building after that. He wasn't sure when he stopped, but Izuku didn't care. He aimed his palm at where the line of destruction lay and concentrated a bead of fire like in the USJ. He infused it with the nuclear energy he barely used and released. The rubble in the immediate area melted in the proximity of the open flames, glass melted, and anything caught in the flames was incinerated. The air screamed as the white liquid flames rushed down the passage Izuku made with All Might's body. A stream of white flames shot through the crater and hit All Might just as he was getting up. He saw it coming and blocked it, thinking it was flames like another, but it seared and burned his flesh. He yelled in pain and whipped his hands down to make an air pocket and leapt away. Izuku saw All Might run and stopped his stream of fire and instead reversed the flow and yanked the remaining thermal energy. Ice cracked around him and the burning and melted building cooled, immediately causing them to crack under the temperature fluctuations. He turned and left a path of ash and slag to see All Might land with his arms and some of his chest burned black. His suit was burned away and covered his chest barely. "Yield," Izuku commanded. "You yield?" he asked, confused and huffing breath. "You will." Izuku launched forward again and absorbed all the light in the area to blind All Might. With his sixth sense, Izuku was fine. All Might protected his wound and was open to getting struck in the knee. Izuku poured one of All Might's strikes and an appropriate amount from a Nomu at the USJ. The following kinetic blast was world-ending. Izuku heard the knee shatter and then All Might fall. He reversed the light and blinded the hero and absorbed the backhand that threw at Izuku in instinct. He heard the hero cry in pain from both his leg and being blinded. All Might didn't give up and clapped his hands, causing a shockwave to emit around him. Izuku absorbed the sound and kinetic blast as everything around him was destroyed. Buildings collapsed and the road was torn up. As he tried to get up, Izuku blasted his weak spot with lightning again, and All Might convulsed and collapsed while coughing up blood onto the ground. Yield! Izuku commanded again. Why do dash? He stopped at the hand that slapped onto his neck. You know, Yagi. The hero's eyes widen at his real name being used. Yes, I'm very good at finding information. I could have ended this exam as soon as you grabbed me, but I didn't. I wanted to see you bloody and battered. Now I ask you again, do you yield, or do I have to absorb the kinetic energy from your heart and blood until you pass out, or glass the area around us with the nuclear fire that made your arms crispy, or take all your thermal energy? Which will it be? Izuku absorbed some of the kinetic energy in his body to prove the point, and he saw All Might get dizzy. He coughed up more blood and wheezed. I yield. The buzzer went off and called for Izuku and Bakugo, saying that they passed. Now tell me, All Might. He said the name with venom in his tone. Can I be a hero?
I'm sorry.
He said softly as steam rose off his body. Too little, too late. Izuku spat and turned to walk away. He met eyes with Bakugo, who was bloodied and stared at Izuku with horror. Why? He asked simply. Ask him. You two have a lot in common. He walked past Bakugo and looked at the destruction he left behind. Hey, you're lucky that the police raid happened. This is what Aldera would have been if they didn't come, people inside or not. He waved at the ash, slag, and glass. Bakugo stayed still and stared at the ground. You blame me? For all of it? He asked. Not all of it, but 10 years of it. He hissed out in hatred of the boy before him. But what does it matter? If you're powerful enough, you can do whatever you want, right? That's what I planned for anyway. With that, he began to walk to the main building, ignoring the scornful look Recovery Girl gave him with the gurney. Izuku felt a sigh of relief escaped him as he walked. He knows it isn't right to get your revenge, but Izuku didn't care for what people said. It was very satisfying. He looked at his energy stores and felt that they were low. Kinetic was pretty low, thermal was similarly low, electric was the same, and nuclear had a drop left. With a sigh, he began to absorb all the thermal energy in the area. Ice and frost cracked as he took every step to the main building. With every step, his reach stretched and his thermal core was filling nicely. When he arrived back at the main building, he had more thermal energy than he used. Behind him was a fringed landscape with a trail of footsteps. He turned back around and opened the door and made his way to the observation room. There were murmured voices, but they cut off when he walked in. He looked at his friends to see how they would react, but they gave him nods and smiles. His heart warmed more than absorbing the thermal energy could. I think we deserve a celebratory dinner of McDonald's, Mina pronounced to the group. Kyuka narrowed her eyes at Mina. Why are you saying it like that? McDonald's? What's wrong with McDonald's? She asked, trying to start an argument. Toru turned to Izuku and held his jacket closer to herself. How are you going to get your jacket back if you have nothing to trade for? She asked innocently. Izuku pulled his gas mask off and smiled at the invisible girl. What else can I trade you for it? He went along with her. Denki and Hanta poked the two bickering girls to draw their attention to the two lovebirds. He has feeling for her, that's for sure, Hanta said. Of course he does. But how to get them together? Mina stroked her non-existent beard. Toru blushed at his attention and pretended to think about it. How about a favor? One time only, no questions asked. She held the jacket out in temptation. If you ask me to do something illegal, it better be worth it. He took the jacket in agreement with a smile. Toru scoffed. What do you take me for? Of course, it will be worth it. She turned to see her group of friends act like they weren't watching the whole time. Denki pretended to pick at his fingernails. Mina twirled her hair, Kyuka played with her earlobes, and Hanta cleaned his tape dispensers. Aizawa came in and met eyes with Izuku. He stared back without backing down. "You're all dismissed." With that, he left. "Someone mentioned McDonald's?" Toru asked her group. "You're all terrible people." Kyuka glared at everyone who looked innocently back. They changed and found a nearby fast food restaurant and promptly walked into it with gusto. It was beginning to get busy as school let out for everyone. The gang ordered their meals and sat down together. Mina cleared her throat and held her cup of ice cream. "To us, we beat the shit out of our teachers." She got many looks from the surrounding people. Luckily, they were still wearing their UA uniforms, and many put the pieces together. "Fuck them teachers." Denki joined in. The rest joined in with mock exasperated looks but had a genuine smiles on their faces. They ate as they chatted about something not related to UA. They talked about a movie coming out that they wanted to see in a group or a game that some showed interest in. The girls talked about heading to the mall to pick some things up for the camp coming up. Aizawa did say if we passed both exams we could go to the camp. "I'm pretty confident I passed the written exam," Toru said to the group. "Why don't we all go tomorrow after school or the weekend?" The gang nodded their heads. "I say the weekend. Gives us more time to look around before it gets too dark," Kyuka said. "I'm free," Hanta put in. The rest agreed and made plans to go to the mall on the weekend as a group. They finished what food they had left and headed out to the train station. Denki unloaded any extra electricity to Izuku, and that reminded him to see if the support course was able to make a steady electricity generator. And maybe they would have some nuclear isotopes laying around. Izuku arrived at the empty apartment and tossed his bag in his room. He sat on the couch and thought about how to get a large amount of kinetic energy. His usual method was to leap off the tree in the clearing, but that would take too long. He could ask Uraraka to send him to the stratosphere and drop him, but he didn't know her well enough to ask her for that. Maybe piss off All Might and get punched a few times? He snorted at the idea. Izuku made a bead of thermal energy and watched it in his hand. He contained the thermal energy it released and redirected it back into the bead. The cycle made him think of absorbing the kinetic energy from the wind, but it hasn't been windy lately and it would be little at a time. He could find an airplane in flight and take its kinetic energy, but Izuku was sure that would mark him as a villain when the airplane stopped dead and plummeted to the earth. An earthquake would be an ideal opportunity for kinetic energy. He would save the area around him and gain who knows how much from the quake. He gave up on thinking and absorbed the bead that would glass the building. Maybe the support department would have an idea. He went to shower and head to bed as he thought about what Toru's favor would be. "Sato and Kirishima, you both failed the practical exam. But luckily for you, everyone is coming to the camp this summer," Aizawa said, and everyone cheered. The two cried in relief but soon stopped at Aizawa's next words. "You'll be stuck with me in remedial classes to see where you failed. Here's the list of stuff you'll need for camp." He left, and on the podium was a stack of papers for everyone to take one. Toru bound it up and took enough for her friends. She took one out of the stack and read as she held out the rest for Mina to distribute. "Nothing surprising," she shrugged. "I have most of this stuff, I think." Denki squinted at the paper. "What about you, Zuku?" Toru turned to him. "I need most of this stuff. Never went camping or the like." Izuku shook his head at everything he would need to buy. Toru linked arms with him and smiled at him. "Good thing we are coming to help you carry everything." The gang made their way out of class and to the exit. Izuku split off from them and headed to the support department. Toru was going to join him but was pulled away by Mina. If Izuku had Kyuka hearing, he would have heard Mina begin to talk about helping Toru with getting together with Izuku. The rest of the gang chipped in to help anyway for the blushing invisible girl. Izuku knocked on the door of the support department and opened it. "Midoriya, you here to test out the generator?" Power Loader saw who it was and asked. "Yes. I was never told it was finished." "What?" Hatsum, never mind. "Come on. Let me show you." He cut himself off and glared at the pink-haired girl who didn't even look up. He led Izuku to a corner of the room and a cylindrical machine sat humming. It has a storage of 50 kilowatts and it generates its electricity until it's full. Give or take a few days to fill. Izuku inspected it in curiosity and then placed his hand on the output and drained it. A large amount of electrical coursed into his body and settled into his core. About 3 large lightning bolts. The small LED screen on the device showed it drop from 50 to 0 in a moment. "How is it?" Power Loader asked the unhinged boy. "Good. Anything bigger?" "How bigger? How big can you get?" "I haven't found a limit to the amount I can store. The more I can have, the more I can use whenever I need to. If you make a nuclear power plant, I could drain every drop, including the nuclear energy." He turned on his sixth sense and found a faint sense of nuclear energy behind a large metal door. Power Loader saw where he was staring and began to get nervous at the boy's attention to the sealed door. "I can maybe make something bigger for electricity, but nuclear energy is going to be a problem." "Someone said nuclear?" Hatsum's muffled voice was heard behind a lead apron, and with face covering and metallic gloved that covered her whole arms that held tongs holding a metal rod. Izuku's eyes zeroed in on the potent nuclear energy and yanked it all into his core. Power Loader screamed at Hatsum to get that away, and Izuku approached to pick up the inert metal rod from the tongs. Hatsum tossed the protective equipment to the side and brought out a device and scanned both Izuku and the rod. She nodded and plucked it out of his hands and went to her station. Izuku followed out of curiosity. "What was that?" Izuku asked over her shoulder as she worked on the rod. She mumbled something as she worked and answered, "Uranium rod. Now a depleted uranium rod." She smiled a mad scientist smile. Izuku could see the potential before him. "I'll do that whenever you need me to if you build me a source of electric energy. Not a small gas generator, I want something powerful." Hatsum turned from her work and her eyes zoomed in on every feature on his face. "What capacity?" She began to smile. "I don't have one. Make a fucking nuclear power plant if you can, and I'll take it all into my core." He began to smile at the contagious smile on the girl. "Now hold on." Power Loader was trying to slow them down. "Also, any unique energies you find, tell me." He showed the small bomb from the villain during his internship. "That's energy from a quirk. I'm not limited to natural energy I can absorb." Hatsum began to vibrate at the new project before her. "Oh, how exciting." She turned to begin, but Izuku pulled her back one last time. "I want more kinetic energy. If you find a way for me to get more, here is my number." He wrote it down in his notebook and gave it to her. She snatched the paper and stuffed it in her overalls. "Welcome, my new customer. Look forward to working with you." Izuku was going to give her his name but paused. She didn't seem the type to remember. "Flux. I'm happy to have someone so dedicated to their work." He smiled. She beamed and shook his hand with her greased-covered one. "Flu. I like it. Now buzz off and let me work." Power Loader looked on in panic at watching his most unstable student team up with the most unhinged boy in the hero department. The same unhinged boy that brought All Might to his knees in surrender with raw power alone. His panic grew as Hatsum pulled another uranium rod out of nowhere and he absorbed it for her benefit. Power Loader had seen what remained of the city the two fought in, and the fire the boy used was not possible. Not even Endeavor's fire has ever gotten that hot. Chapter 23. Favor. The gang made plans to head into the shopping district as a group on the weekend. For Izuku, the weekend was mostly spent at the apartment alone, with the back of his mind drifting to the empty room down the hall and the sticky note in the junk drawer. But now he had something to distract him, his friends. He took some of his extra money and the debit card that kept getting funds put in even after Inko's departure. He put on a light jacket and headed out to meet up with the others. On the way, his mind drifted back to Inko. He had very mixed feelings about her. He had lost all love for her, but why would she pay for the next 3 years on the apartment? Some part of his mind hoped now that he had a quirk she would try to reconnect with him, but nothing of the sort happened. He felt anger flare up with sadness accompanying next to it. But what else could he do right now other than keep moving forward with his plans? His thoughts were thrown off kilter when an arm wrapped around his elbow. He looked over to see Toru giving him a worried look. His heart stuttered at her proximity. "Is everything okay?" she asked. He smiled warmly toward her, and any thoughts from before were washed away completely. "It is now," he said without thinking, and his face burned at what he had said to her. Toru ducked her head and smiled, giddiness washing over her. "Well, I'm happy to hear that. She held tighter onto his arm and looked up at his receding blush. Izuku cleared his throat and changed the subject with no tact. So, have you found what you were going to use your favor for? The train lurched and began to move again. Toru gave him a smile he couldn't interpret. I have a very good favor to ask, but I just have to find the right time. Her face flushed with heat that Izuku could see easily. Of course, you need the right time for me to cause a distraction for you to rob the bank. He nodded sagely. Toru laughed at him and bumped her shoulder with his. I'd figure you would be all right in case of heroes coming to stop you since you kicked All Might's ass not a week ago. I'd imagine you can take anyone at that point. Izuku smiled and laughed with her at their imagination of robbing a bank together. They stayed in companionable silence with her head on his shoulder and his hand on her arm. They basked in each other's presence until the stop came for them to get off. The rest of their friends joined the two since they were early. Hyuka came first and greeted the two. She internally rolled her eyes at them not getting together already, but she let them be without pushing. Denki and Hanta joined soon after, with Mina running up to them almost being late. Everyone ready? When everyone nodded, Mina pointed forward and led them into the shopping district. Then let's go. In a group, they walked into the mall while joking around. Toru never let go of Izuku's arm as they walked store to either buy something or just to look around for fun. They got some looks from the crowd, some recognizing them from the sports festival. Izuku got the most attention since he won in the more brutal way possible. He caught some whispered conversations, but he did his best to ignore them. Hyuka heard many too and shot glares at a few. Izuku felt grateful for her friendship. Right then. Who needs what? I just need some small things here and there. Bug spray, travel necessities, sunscreen, and the like. Mina walked backward and spoke to them as a group. Denki furrowed his brow. Can you get sunburns? Mina scoffed. Of course I can. Just because I'm pink you think I can't get sunburns? Denki raised his hands in surrender. That's why I was asking. You two done bickering? We are being left behind. Hanta pointed at the other three walking into a storefront. Disgraceful, what would the boss say to this? He said in his gruff voice. Hey, since Izuku is the leader, what would that make us in the hierarchy? Mina began to follow the rest of her friends. Well, Toru is his right-hand woman. Of course. Hanta nodded along with Denki. We would have to be his lieutenants, right? Mina said. Hyuka barked out a laugh and turned to them. You're the grunts, she said with a smirk. How dare you? Hanta said in mock offense. Boss, what are we? Izuku looked confused at them and shook his head. Embarrassing with all the attention you are drawing. Hanta reeled back as if stuck. Boss, he said sadly as the others burst out laughing and pointing at him. They got many more looks from passersby. They kept moving on with their shopping, with the odd thing here or there tossed into their bags. Izuku was the biggest shopper since he didn't have many of the supplies to go camping since he'd never been camping. They had fun anyways throughout their day together. They were only kicked out of one shop when Denki knocked over a shelf from being spooked by Hyuka. Granted, the shelf was very wobbly to begin with, but the owner was not happy with the mess. They had lunch in the dining area with greasy food on everyone's plates. Mina brought up something she was curious about. Izuku, she said with her mouth full. She swallowed when she got a glare from the green-haired boy at her manners. How many people do you have profiles for in your notebook? Izuku finished his bite of food and said, In that notebook? 47 people, hero or villains. They made noises of appreciation. Who do you decide to write in them? Anyone who seems to be a threat or interesting enough, either quirk or other abilities. He shrugged and bit into his burger again. Toru slid closer to him and said softly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Which one am I? Was I interesting to you? A combination of her soft voice next to his ear and the way she asked made Izuku inhale his bit of food and began to choke immediately. His friends began to panic and then hero training kicked in. Hanta jumped in first to give Izuku the Heimlich maneuver. It didn't take too much and Izuku was breathing again. I am so sorry, Toru said almost in tears. It's okay. I'm okay, he quickly said with a warm smile to reassure her. You were very interesting to me to answer your question. The red on his face was hard to tell if it was from what he had said or from not getting oxygen into his lungs. Toru gave him a wobbly laugh. Mina and Denki wiggled their eyebrow at each other and held in laughter. "See that? I'm definitely getting promoted for saving the boss's life," Hanta said proudly. Everyone sat down to finish their good after that and then continued to walk around the mall until they got everything everyone needed. They decided to call it a day and head home to their homes. They all walked to the train station while chatting among themselves. One by one, they got off to switch trains, and then it was only Izuku and Toru. He got off with her to wait for her train. It was Izuku's stop anyway, so it worked out well. The station was empty and Toru shifted and then turned to Izuku. "I want to ask for my favor now." Toru moved to face him. She had a determined face as she stood before him. Izuku smiled. "All right, no questions asked." Toru's face burned slightly at what she is going to ask, but he'd firm to her resolve. She pointed at him. "I want the title of your girlfriend. And you my boyfriend." Izuku's smile froze and his mind flashed through memories of girls doing similar things to him only to laugh in his face and mock him for thinking they were serious. He felt cold sweat cover the back of his neck and tried to focus on the present. He reminded himself that Toru is different. She wouldn't do such a thing even as a joke. But the back of his mind said she was lying and this will end just like before with him crying alone and hurt. He didn't want that. Toru watched Izuku's face flash with various emotions and she didn't know what to do. Panic began to rise and she quietly spoke. "Izuku, if you don't want to, that's okay. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked you something like that." She felt tears crop up at seeing Izuku distraught and for herself at this idea. He managed to hear her in time and focused on her. "You're not joking?" That is all he was able to say with his throat closing up. She shook her head vigorously. "I would never joke about anything like this. I've liked you for a long time and wanted to find a good way to confess. I admire your determination, how kind you are to the people you care about, and how you look at me. You see me not just where my voice is. I wouldn't ever hurt you in any way." Tears flowed down her cheeks but smiled up at him. She slowly took his hand as she spoke. Izuku gripped her hand in absolute hope. "You won't leave me?" He couldn't stop the croak in his voice and the stinging sensation coming from his eyes. She shook her head again. "I won't." She beamed up at him and Izuku pulled her into a tight hug as she laughed into his chest. "I'll be your boyfriend then." Izuku felt her arms wrap around him and hold him tight. "And I'll be your girlfriend." She giggled and tried to bury deeper into him. They stayed like that for a bit longer and then pulled apart. Toru wiped her face from tears with a smile. He couldn't contain his smile and held her fire hand while watching his girlfriend. She laughed when she caught him staring and squeezed his hand in response. "So what now?" she asked. Izuku stopped for a moment. "I don't know." He didn't watch much TV or read any romance novels, so he didn't know where to proceed from there. Toru giggled again at the consternation on his face. She went back and hugged him again. "It doesn't matter, we do what we want." She hummed with the warmth radiating from her boyfriend. He hugged her back automatically while his mind flashed through thoughts of how to have a girlfriend. He should take her on a date, take care of her, and buy gifts, right? "Stop thinking so much. Don't worry about it." She looked up at him from his arms to reassure him. All right?" He nodded. "What does it mean to have a girlfriend then?" Logically, he knew there was more, but he wanted her to give a layout, at least for his comfort. She pulled back and hooked her arm with his. "It means we get to hold hands, hug, and be close together as much as we want." Izuku furrowed his brow. "Don't we already do that?" He raised an eyebrow at her. She laughed and leaned on him. "Or we can do more lewd things," she said softly and looked up at him. "Like cuddles." She whispered like it was a top-secret thing. He recognized her joking tone and put on a look of disbelief. "Before marriage? How devious!" They stopped and burst out laughing together. Every time they calmed down and looked at each other again, they laughed again. When their stomachs were sore, they began to peter off. Toru leaned on him again and Izuku tentatively put an arm around her. She leaned closer and hummed in contentment. The train for Toru began to get close and they reluctantly got up. The train got close and it was empty for the most part. He walked her closer to the train and she spun in front of him again. She squirmed a bit but looked at him with more heat on her face. It's only right for you to send me off with a kiss. Izuku blushed and nodded jerkily. He quickly tried to decide where. Forehead. No. Lips too soon? Cheek a safe bet, maybe. He was taking too long and saw Toru take the decision out of his hands. She leaned forward and kissed him on the lips before beaming up at him and quickly getting on the train before the doors closed. She smiled at him through the window as the train lurched away. Izuku stood there until the station was empty once again. His smile couldn't be contained as he turned back to the stairs and headed to the apartment. He heard some chuckling and turned to see the old couple from before. "Good on ya, lad." The old man raised his cane to him in salute. "Leave the boy be." The old woman huffed a laugh and swatted his arm. Izuku kept his smile and bowed slightly at the elderly couple. He heard them laugh a bit more as he walked down the stairs to the road to the apartment. His mind is still on Toru becoming his girlfriend. His smile widened more at the thought. His chest was filled with more warmth than any thermal energy could fill him. Izuku arrived at the apartment with his bags of supplies for the camp. He began to pack his bag for the week away coming soon. His smile never dropped as he kept thinking of Toru. When he was done, he went to his sketching notebook he had been working on for a bit. When Toru asked for a copy of his drawing from his analysis notebook, he had given her one, but now he was working on a few more. They were copies of pictures he took with his friends, but with Toru drawn in with careful detail. He had half a dozen done and ready to give to her, and he thinks it's a good time to do so. Could work as his first gift for her. After all, boyfriends give gifts to their girlfriends. He was interrupted from making dinner when his phone went off. The group chat with all his friends was pinging him. He opened it and saw multiple thumbs-up emojis sent to him from everyone but Toru. He soon found out it was because they found out about Toru and him getting together as a couple. Toru had told Mina and Kyoka, and from there Mina told everyone, hence the emojis. He shook his head and smiled at his phone. The weekend ended and Izuku was on his way to UA to board the bus for camp. He and Toru talked most of their time apart and chatted about anything. Izuku mostly listened but was happy to hear her talk about her favorite show. His stop came and he headed to UA with his bag for the days to come. He found where he was supposed to meet up with his class and joined his friends. Hanta, Denki, and Mina gave him finger guns with sly smirks on all their faces. Izuku blushed but smiled at his friends' antics. "Leave him be." Kyoka batted their hands down. Mina was the first to round up next to him. "So, tell me, how was it?" Izuku blushed more. "How was what? Was the sun setting behind her as you confessed your feelings for each other? The wind blew her hair as she looked up to you and pleaded for your love." Mina narrated a scene she could see in her mind. Izuku relived the moment and was started just a bit when her description was very close. Get your hands off him, hussy." Toru leaped onto Izuku's back and pushed Mina's face away. Izuku immediately grabbed onto her legs and stumbled forward to balance himself. He felt Toru's arms hug him from behind and her head on his shoulder. Izuku smiled at her close presence. "How dare you call me a hussy?" Mina said imperiously. "Denki is the only hussy in my presence." She pointed at him. "Hey!" Denki said, offended. "Not a week into dating and look at how shameless they are." Hanta teased. Toru stuck her tongue out at him, but only Izuku saw and chuckled warmly. "It's nice to see you again," he said. Toru hugged him tighter and pecked his cheek from over his shoulder in response. "It's about time you two got together finally," Denki said with a smile to them. "What? Why?" Izuku asked, confused. "It's been obvious that you two had feelings for each other for like ever." Mina shrugged and nodded with Denki. "Did everyone know?" Izuku blushed a bit at the realization. "Yep. The four that are not on Izuku's back chorus." "You were very oblivious." Mina jabbed with a teasing smile. "Don't worry about it." Toru smiled at him over his shoulder. Izuku smiled in response, and before he could say anything, Aizawa's voice drawled out. "All right, everyone is here. Load your bags under the bus and get in. Don't waste time." Toru didn't get off Izuku's back, and he smiled warmly at her. He picked his and her bag up and tossed them in. Toru got off when Izuku got close to the doors and followed him in and chose a pair of empty seats for them. He naturally joined her and she hooked her arm with his and leaned in him. Izuku felt the warmth fill him as everyone settled down and the bus began to move. Chapter 24. Camp. Izuku and his little gang of friends chatted while they rode the bus to wherever Aizawa was taking them. They were quiet since most of the class decided to take a nap, including Toru, who was snuggled up under Izuku's arm. For his part, he did his best to stay still and enjoy the feeling of Toru's head on his lap. After almost 2 hours, they stopped on the side of the road. Izuku gently woke Toru up and she smiled warmly at him before squeezing him and getting up. Everyone was stretching their legs as they looked over the railing into the forest. They saw a black car roll up to them and 3 figures walked out and to them. Izuku immediately recognized the 2 women and mentally brought up their profiles. Compared to many heroes, the Wild Pussycats are one of the better ones since they are focused on mountain and forest rescue. He also took note that they were meeting the class at a rest stop and not at the camp. Izuku subtly kept Toru close and tapped Hanta and whispered loud enough for Kyuka to hear as well. Something is fishy. Not bad but odd why they would meet us here instead of at the camp. Hanta took a moment to come to the realization and Kyuka was already telling the other 2 of his gang. Is there something you think is more important than greeting your hosts? Aizawa's angry tone was aimed at Izuku and glaring at him. Izuku didn't break eye contact and said, "Yes, I was telling them why would our hosts meet us here instead of at the camp. So I told them to keep an eye out. You know, like you always say, to be prepared." Just the tiniest bit of snark leaked out. Aizawa kept glaring until Pixie Bob laughed. "Oh, this one has claws." Mandalay looked between the student and the teacher in apprehension. "Well, I guess the cat is out of the bag. Head straight west and good luck." Pixie Bob slammed her paws on the ground and the whole class fell to the forest. Izuku picked Toru into a princess carry and absorbed the fall. Hanta used his tape to grab Denki and slow their fall, while Mina dug her fingers into the cliffside and slid down. Kyuka's earlobes slammed into the ground first and a blast of sound pushed her up to break her fall. They weren't the only ones to land on their feet. "My hero!" Toru giggled and jumped off Izuku's arms after a peck on the cheek. He composed himself quickly and focused on what Pixie Bob said about heading west. He looked at the sun and turned in the right direction. "West we go." Izuku began to move with his gang of friends joining him. "Shouldn't we stick together?" Yairuzo said to the group leaving. "Does it matter? We are all headed west, so head west." Izuku shrugged. No one got to say anything else as a creature of dirt emerged out of the ground. Izuku didn't let it finish building itself and blasted it with a concentrated thermal beam. The head turned to nothing and it collapsed. "Oh, never mind. You are already using your quirks." Pixie Bob said, a bit deflated as she watched the lead group not hesitate to push forward. Mandalay noticed Aizawa's eyes on the green-haired boy and asked, "Is he going to be a problem?" He gave out a sigh and rubbed his face. "I don't know. He is one of the most complicated students I've ever had. He's cold to everyone but his close friends. He is smart enough to bring up 2 of the worst academic students in a few spots. And his quirk is extremely powerful." "Wow, what is it?" Pixie Bob joined in the conversation. "Energy absorbing and storage. He absorbs a kinetic strike and he can release it back at his opponent later. He's not limited to just one energy." Aizawa began to walk to the black car. The 2 rescue heroes looked at each other in surprise. "And the limit? How many can he store and how much?" Mandalay joined the tired hero in the car. Aizawa sighed again and answered, "I don't know, I don't think there is. Come on." Pixie Bob laughed behind the steering wheel. "Why do you think there is no limit?" Aizawa thought about what he was about to say. "For the exams, we had the staff fight 2 students. Escape, pass. Beat the hero by capture, pass." He took in a big breath and said, "Midoriya was paired against All Might. He beat the number 1 hero into surrender with raw power and strategy. The other 2 heroes were quiet at the revelation." "He was handicapped, right? That's how he won?" Pixie Bob asked. "He was. The fire he shot out destroyed 2 city blocks, also melted the weights on his arms while tearing the exposed flesh." "Oh, that is all," either said for the rest of the trip. Denki ran forward with his enhanced body and bashed the dirt monster with a large branch he picked up. Mina was throwing controlled acid shots at range while Izuku picked up rocks and launched them at supersonic speeds through the beasts. He switched back to thermal energy and carved out chunks of dirt with his beams of pure thermal energy. You know, I feel kinda useless right now. Toru walked behind her friends as they obliterated everything in their path. I know how you feel, Kyoka said next to her. Don't feel bad. Just let your man take care of the problem. Hanta yelled back at them as he wrapped up the legs of one beast and Denki finished it off. Toru hummed in thought. You know what, I like the sound of that. Izuku, get rid of those beasts for me, she said in a noble voice. Why, of course, my lady. At once. Izuku played along and got what he wanted with giggles from Toru that warmed his chest. Gods, you two are so adorable. Mina squealed before melting the chest of a beast. I'm starting to get jealous, Denki said while taking a break. How much further? Hold on. Izuku blasted one beast with sound and it crumbled apart. He jogged forward and blasted up into the air with kinetic energy. He found the campsite and he landed with no issue. Maybe halfway? Denki groaned and turned to their leader. Can you just carve a way to the site? It'll be a waste of energy. The beasts will still come even if I carve a path with thermal energy. Izuku shook his head and resisted the thought of the amount of thermal energy he could get if he burned trees along the way. Guys, I think I'm turning into a pyromaniac. Well, don't. Toru, is that a deal breaker? Mina joked. To be honest, I went through a pyro phase when I was younger, she said sheepishly. God, a match made in heaven. Hanta laughed while swinging back and forward to distract a beast for Mina to splash it with acid. They kept on fighting through the forest with an occasional break here or there. They haven't seen the rest of the class, but they could still hear the occasional explosion behind them. The two girls behind the group did get a chance to do something when a few beasts came at them from behind. Izuku would have taken care of it, but Toru waved him off and charged forward with Kyuka. They were the first to arrive at the campsite, tired but victorious. They saw the bus they arrived on, but no one else. Izuku shrugged and moved to sit on the picnic tables nearby. The rest followed and plopped around their leader. You know, I'm pretty grateful that it's a nice day out and not sweltering, Denki said, leaning back on the seats. Yeah, you're right. The sun is warm, but there's a cool breeze. Kyuka nodded. Toru leaned on Izuku's shoulder, but didn't get any closer since they were all sweaty and gross. So what now? Should we go wander inside or something? Toru felt cooler than she did apart from Izuku. She raised an eyebrow at him, but he only smiled. They sat and waited for a few minutes longer until Mandalay walked out with Pixie Bob and Aizawa. They all turned to them and Izuku gave them a lazy wave. Aizawa kept his neutral face and turned away after looking them over. The other two were surprised at their speed but didn't say anything. Izuku noticed another heat source coming through the doors. A boy around 5 walked out and crossed his arms with an annoyed face. Izuku saw that emotion and see himself mirror it when he was younger. That saddened Izuku more than he thought, but he didn't show it. Pixie Bob strolled up to them. Well, aren't you all fast? She chuckled. But you left your class behind, and why is it cooler here? Because we're the cool kids. Denki posed and got smacked on the back of the head by Kyuka. We were never told to stay together. Just head west. We did so. Izuku didn't respond about the area being cooler. Who's that? Izuku nodded to the boy who was glaring at them. That's Koda. Come say hello. Mandalay said, trying to introduce her nephew. Izuku motioned to the seat beside him on the bench. The area is cooler around me. Come sit if you like. Why would I want to be anywhere near some hero wannabe? The boy sneered. Koda, Mandalay said reproachfully. You don't like heroes? I don't like many of them either. The wild pussycats are alright though. He kept trying to talk to the boy, but he got a furrowed brow look from the boy and Izuku patted the empty spot next to him for Koda to sit. He didn't move closer. The adults also gave him a look, but Mandalay was more grateful for trying to connect with her nephew. They didn't get to say anything else as the rest of the class stumbled out of the treeline and into the campgrounds. Once the members of the WWPC finished talking, they sent them to eat. They all gave them grateful looks and made their way to the cafeteria. When everyone was done eating their fill, they went to the baths. After a quick shower, Izuku joined the rest of the class in the hot outdoor bath. Izuku sunk into the hot water with his upper body exposed. Scars over scars littered his chest and shoulders. from burn scars to cuts. Izuku didn't care for the stairs and slowly sunk into the hot water until the water was at his chin. He hummed in pleasure and added some of his thermal energy to the water. Izuku, I'm pretty sure you're not supposed to boil everyone. Denki snarked at the heating water. Just a little boiling is fine. Hanta mimicked Izuku and sunk into the hot water next to his friends. Hey, Midoriya? Kirishima asked. Izuku hummed in response. The redhead continued. Are you and Hagakure dating? Izuku rose so he could speak without water rushing into his mouth. Yes, we are. Why are you asking? Kirishima gave him a shark-toothed smile. Congratulations. I was just curious was all. Sato, Shoji, and Tokoyami gave him nods as well. Izuku smiled a bit. Thanks. When everyone was sufficiently pruned by the near-boiling water, they made their way to their sleeping area. They were told that they will have an early start, so everyone got situated for bed. Izuku found one corner and lay down. Denki and Hanta chose spots next to him, and Izuku felt better about sleeping in an open area like he was. Some of the guys chose to play some card games before sleep, but Izuku didn't join. His back facing the wall, he fell asleep to the sound of the others talking softly. So, what is Midoriya like? Uraraka asked of the invisible girl when the girls sat in their room to sleep. Oh, girl talk. Mina giggled and sat next to Toru. I mean, I already know, but go on. I am also curious about your relationship with Midoriya. He is one of the most complicated guys I've met. He is thoughtful like at the sports festival to warm the area after Todoroki's match for me. And then he does something like at the exam with All Might or his match against Bakugo. So you joined in next to Uraraka. Yairuzo didn't say anything, but it was obvious that she was also interested in the conversation. Toru shifted in her seated position. He has good reasons for what he does. He is very good at keeping things apart, like how he treats anyone else but Bakugo. She curled her lip at the name at the end. But forget that. We just got together on the weekend and he's been so sweet so far. She squealed. Like what? Uraraka almost bounced around. He's so gentle when I'm around him. Small things like that. She smiled to herself and thought about her boyfriend. They are so sweet that I'm pretty sure I'm getting a cavity just from their proximity. Hyuka chuckled. They kept chatting for a bit longer until one began to get drowsy and they all decided to go to sleep. Toru lay down and fell asleep, imagining Izuku falling asleep with his arm around her. So far this year, we have been pushing you in experience and technique with both your quirk and other abilities. Now, you are here to stretch your quirks like a muscle. You will tear it and rest it over and over to improve your output. Aizawa drawled to his class as most were still rubbing their eyes clean. He tossed a familiar baseball to Izuku. He caught it and moved forward. He knew what Aizawa was trying to say, but his quirk is very different from others. Everyone's quirk can stretch and strengthen, but he can only put out what it takes in. If he had the same amount of energy from the beginning of the year, then the distance will be the same. So he will improve his methods with his quirk. He raised his open hand and a bead of the sun coalesced at the palm of his hand. He concentrated on the distance of the blast. He released and a bar of liquid fire exploded into the air when he stopped firing and threw the ball with about the same amount he used on the first day of UA. It rocketed forward and broke the sound barrier as it traveled along the path of the flames. What was the reason for the fire? Aizawa raised an eyebrow. Air expands when heated. I made a tunnel of thinned air for a more efficient throw using the same amount of energy I used on the first day. Izuku gestured to the device he was holding for the readout. Aizawa looked at the device and it read 718.1 meters, over 150 meters more than before. You get the idea. We will split you up with the right groups for your quirk. Midoriya with me. Aizawa let the class get separated by the hero team and waited for Izuku to join him. Izuku stayed where he was standing and watched his classmates get split up for their quirk. He didn't speak and waited for his teacher to begin. Aizawa stared at Izuku and he stared back with a raised brow. Aizawa sighed at the problematic student. You could have been expelled for your stunt during the midterm exam. Izuku tilted his head and stared back at Aizawa. Why would I be expelled and why didn't you? He asked with no inflection in his tone of voice. Because you went too far in the exam and on top of that you missed the whole point of the exam to work on your weaknesses. I treated the exam how I would treat it in real life. If I ever go against a person with the power of All Might, I will take the threat down before he could level a city," he said with all seriousness. "As for why I didn't work with Bakugo, it was unnecessary. Would you take out a single target with 2 people when 1 is sufficient? As you said, it's illogical. Why wasn't I expelled?" Izuku had a very good idea why not. Aizawa narrowed his eyes at his student when he threw his words back at him. "It's safer to keep you close than have you leave UA," Izuku scoffed. "I stay at UA of my own volition. I have plans in case I didn't like how UA was, how it could have reminds me of Aldera." "What kind of plans?" Aizawa furrowed his brows at the boy. "Various kinds." Izuku shrugged non-committally. "This isn't going to work for me. I don't have a limit I can stretch." He waved at the rest of his class using their quirks to the limit and further beyond. Aizawa furrowed but answered anyway. "Show me how many energies you can absorb. Kinetic, electric, thermal, sound, light, nuclear, and quirk energy." He rattled off. "Quirk energy?" He raised an eyebrow. Izuku made a small bead of green energy on the tip of his finger and flicked it to the ground. He commanded it to detonate and a tiny pop went off. "Some guy during the internship trying to use me and a lady as hostages. I absorbed the energy he produced and he can make bombs." Aizawa nodded at his explanation and went on. "What range can you absorb something? So long as there is an energy between each source. I don't think I have a range or I haven't found one yet." "Explain." He rolled his hand. "Thermal energy can be continually absorbed since there is always more thermal energy in the air to be drawn in. Imagine a bubble expanding so long as there's more nearby. That but for everything, I think." Izuku held his hand like he was containing a ball and steadily expanding the size. Aizawa was quiet for a moment as that sunk in. With a sigh he continued. "Then you will work on precision." Izuku opened his hand and shot out a dozen beams of fire. A dozen little flames danced on the ground. "Pick 2. Aizawa furrowed his brow and pointed at 2 very near others. They were extinguished as the flames turned into streams of fire and were sucked into Izuku's hand. "I exclusivity work on control and techniques for using my quirk since I get energy when I see an opportunity for it. And you don't have to work on the speed of absorption." Aizawa scowled slightly. "What are you lacking then?" "Physical training. The only reason I went with Endeavor for my internship was to take his fire and get hand-to-hand combat training." Izuku opened his palm to show a flame that had the distinct coloration of the number 2 hero. Aizawa grunted and pointed to Tiger with other students. "With him and later find an empty spot and absorbed as much energy as you can without disturbing the others." Izuku didn't say anything and turned and left. He stretched and joined in with what Tiger was doing. Once he had a good sweat and his body ached with every movement. He walked over to Todoroki and had him shoot flames at him while he absorbed anything he could. For a few hours, that was how he spent his day. Every once in a while, he looked over to Toru as she shot beams of light in every direction she could and as fast as she could. When he got tired of flames and went over to Denki, and he did the same to Izuku as Todoroki did. One good thing about the camp was that he was gaining a large amount of energy. Chapter 25. Interruption. Izuku was the only one who wasn't dragging their feet to cook their dinner. His training so far has been physical and led by Tiger. While a sore, he didn't have quirk exhaustion like everyone else did. His quirk didn't tire him when he used it. The only limit he had found with his quirk was what he had stored in his core. He was pretty happy with it. The ingredients were laid out for them to cook and there were multiple outdoor stoves for them to use. Everyone decided to work on a stew and Izuku immediately began to get to work. He lit the wood stoves and set the pots of water to heat up. After that, he began to slice up the ingredients with practiced motions that caught his friend's eyes. Toru watched him from his elbow. "You're like a pro. Who taught you to cook?" "Yeah. Not even my mom can work as well as you can in the kitchen," Denki complimented. Izuku paused for a second and continued. "No one taught me. I'm just had good practice." He dumped the cubed meat into the pot. Toru bit her lip and looked worried at what he said. Looking around, she could see their gaggle of friends also caught what he had said. "What else can you cook up?" She injected cheer into her tone. Izuku looked over at her and smiled. "A few things. Nothing fancy, but maybe one day I'll cook something up for you." His ears burned slightly at the proclamation. Toru ducked her head and bumped it against his arm. "I would like that," she said softly, and a smile hidden from view. "Get a room." Mina looked around to see who said that, even though it was obvious to everyone it was her. Izuku cleared his throat and focused back on cooking, even though his smile was evident to everyone. Toru helped where she could, and the others copied Izuku's motions to cook for their pot of stew. The rest of the class did their own thing and cooked at their stations. When the food was done, everyone sat down with bowls to eat as a group. His group of friends thoroughly enjoyed their meal and filled their bowls for seconds. While eating, Izuku noticed Kota go into the woods and made note of it. The rest of the day was theirs, and most spent it resting from the grueling training hours before. Izuku did the same and found a spot to sit and rest his sore muscles. Toru joined him and leaned against him. They didn't speak and basked in each other's presence. Izuku cooled the area and they had a nice breeze blowing over them. The next day was similar to the day before. They got up early and then went to their training areas. Izuku went to an empty field and absorbed one energy at a time in a large radius. He switched as fast as he could between energies, but for him it was instant. 1 second it's a black void around Izuku, and then everything is visible but mute to the point it's disorienting. The dirt crumbled from intense heat and froze with fog close to the ground. The ground shattered from the kinetic blast outward, and then everything went still as everything near was stopped by the absorbed kinetic energy. From a distance, it looked like an apocalypse over and over again. When the adults called it a day and they finished eating, Ragdoll gathered them around to have some fun. A test of courage. 1B will go into the woods and prep an area to scare one coming through, she said giddy. Izuku's class was paired off and he was with Ojiro. Toru came up to them, and just as she was going to say something, "No switching," Mandalay's voice reached them. Toru pouted and sulked off with a dejected look back at Izuku. He gave her a reassuring smile and nodded to Ojiro in greeting. He nodded back. Izuku never had a reason to speak to the boy. When he was doing his analysis on everyone in the class to see if any of them would be a threat to him in any way, he ranked close to the bottom. Mandalay began to send them into the woods in intervals. Toru paired with Jairu was the second pair to go in. Izuku smiled a bit at hearing the distant yelps of fear and waited for them to be sent in. His smile faded when he smelled smoke in the air and saw the blue glow in the distance. He sensed a wave of heat coming from the glow, and Mandalay saw the same. They talked about it being an accident, but a villain jumping out of the woods with a large makeshift sword confirmed it was an attack. Izuku fear blossomed in his chest at the thought of Toru. He ignored what the villains were saying and could only think of Toru getting ambushed. "Kota, head back to the building now." His thoughts were thrown back to the present and his feet skidded to a stop just as he was going to blast off to find her. "Fuck!" Izuku cursed loudly and turned to where he had seen Kota walk into the woods alone the day before. He had to trust Toru to take care of herself. She was training to be a hero just like him, and she had Jairu with her. "I'll find him," he shouted back and blasted into the air and ruining his pair of shoes. He was high in the air and could see a lot of the forest before him. He saw a few outcroppings of stone scattered and focuses on them to start. He scanned 3 before finding 2 shapes on one. A small one and a hooded one. He blasted down and sped up like a ballistic missile aimed right at the cloaked figure approaching Kota, who was backing away. Izuku ignited his hands and a comet collided with the figure. He came to a dead stop, and then a blast of kinetic and thermal energy sent the cloaked figure flying. Fire bloomed out and Izuku turned to Kota, who was shaking in fear and tears covered his face. "We need to go." Izuku picked the small boy up and blasted off into the air with a yelp of fear from the child. "It's him," Kota whispered, clutching at Izuku. "Who is who?" Izuku asked just as a large figure jumped from the ground they left and tackled Izuku and Kota out of the air. Izuku shielded the boy with his body and absorbed the crash landing. Izuku was cut from the branches they fell through and came to a stop. He looked over at Kota and was relieved to see him unharmed. He turned around at the sound of a tree branch breaking and saw the figure of Muscular. He was in one of Izuku's notebooks, and he was very aware of what could have happened if Izuku didn't go for Kota instead of Toru. "You pack a punch," And you are one of my targets. How dash Izuku didn't let him finish as he blasted a beam of liquid fire at the serial killer. Muscular covered his face with his arms and the muscle were burned away quickly. He moved to the side and the burnt muscles were covered by new muscles. Izuku pushed Koda away as the villain charged at him. He absorbed the punch he threw and the next few until the villain picked him up and threw him against a tree. Izuku was fine, but Muscular didn't let up and kicked Izuku to no effect. He was burned by a lightning bolt hitting his chest and shoulder. He convulsed for a moment and Izuku slipped away from being pinned. Izuku retaliated by launching a kinetic strike at his leg, but the muscles absorbed most of the impact. He was batted away as Muscular regained his faculties. "You're fun, but I want to see blood." Muscular cried in joy and charged forward. Izuku coated himself in scorching fire and met the charge. He blinded the villain with a flash of light and tried to grab onto him to absorb the kinetic energy of his body to knock him out. He was able to grab him by the neck, but Muscular yanked him off and threw him again. Izuku growled in anger at being held up from looking for Toru. He saw Koda frozen in fear behind Muscular and the villain didn't miss it. He turned around to see and turned back with a vicious grin. Izuku howled in anger as Muscular turned around to smash the small boy into a paste. Izuku began to coalesce two beads of fire, but it wouldn't be fast enough to stop Muscular, who was already halfway to Koda. Izuku blasted off the ground and reached the villain and absorbed the electric energy in his body. Muscular collapsed like a puppet, his strings cut. Once he was down, Izuku senses the electricity in Muscular's body appear again, but he didn't move. Koda stared at the villain who killed his parents face down and Izuku standing on top of his bulked form. Izuku was dirty and cut up from the landing with bruises on his body from Muscular grabbing him. What remained of his shirt showed a multitude of scars over his chest. "We need to go," Izuku repeated, sucking in lungfuls of breath. "Is he dead?" Koda asked with a tremble in his voice. "No, come on." Izuku picked up the boy and blasted off again to the building ahead. Izuku had theories of what would happen if he pulled energy from a living being. Thermal will kill them from the temperature shock, and if he yanked all the thermal, then they will be frozen solid. Kinetic energy would knock them out from oxygen deprivation and make them have a stroke by stopping their heart by yanking the energy. Electric energy would most likely cause their limbs to stop responding because of the electrical signals being interrupted, and if yanked, they will either lose control of their body or go brain dead from the loss of electric energy in their brain. He had sensed the electric energy in Muscular's brain, and it wasn't right anymore, and he didn't care. Izuku saw the buildings and Eraserhead fighting against a villain. The villain shot blue flames, and then they were cut off by Eraserhead's quirk activating again. While in the air, Izuku aimed a hand at the villain, and a lightning bolt speared through the villain. It dissolved into mud, and Eraserhead looked up at who shot at his opponent. Izuku landed with no impact and set Koda down. His face was still covered in tears, but he was safe. "Take Koda, I have to go." Izuku began to run back into the woods, but Aizawa called out, "No, you are staying here. It's too dangerous for you to go out there," Aizawa said in a no-nonsense voice. He pulled the young boy and waited for Izuku to follow him. Izuku glared back at his homeroom teacher. "I'm going." Then he covered his body in the void just as Aizawa activated his quirk to stop him. He wasn't able to enjoy the shock on his face as Izuku's quirk didn't deactivate as he had something more important to do. He blasted off and disappeared into the woods. With consecutive bursts of kinetic energy, Izuku propelled himself over the woods and where the trail began for the test of courage. His mind raced as he began to scan frantically for Toru and his friends. He spotted 3 figures, 2 fighting and 1 pinned near a tree. He dropped and only saw it was Uraraka and Tsuyu. He startled them and without waiting, blasted the female villain with sound energy. She cried in agony and clutched her ears. Any glass on her shattered and she fell to her knees. He blasted forward and hit her with his knee at full force, causing her to slump to the ground. "That way to the buildings." Izuku pointed to his classmates and didn't wait for them to respond. He blasted off again and began to look. He saw more battles but didn't stop like he did for the last one. He saw lighting being shot out and fire in another area. He was sure they would be all right. He began to worry when he saw a purple mist close to the ground. He landed before it and experimentally ignited his hand. The mist burned away, and then he increased the temperature as it moved away from him. He ran and stretched his senses to find any thermal signatures. Finally, he found them, Kyuka and Toru laying on the ground. He rushed to them and checked on their pulses. They were alive, but he didn't know what the mist was. He tried to wake them up, but they were unresponsive. A few tears leaked out of his eyes at seeing Toru as she was, but he focused on getting them back to camp and to safety. He couldn't leave either behind, so he took off his tattered shirt and strapped the lighter of the two to his back and carried Toru in his arms. With a grunt of effort, he began to make his way back. He absorbed each footfall to dampen the impact for the two. Thankfully, he didn't have to go far. How he was as Mina and Hanta found him. They rushed over and took Kyuka off his back, but Izuku held Toru close. They were unharmed but didn't need to say much as they moved in the direction of the camp. Izuku continued to worry for his friends and the girl in his arms that still hasn't shown any reaction. Izuku heard a noise and sensed someone in the trees behind him getting close fast. Everything behind Izuku was pushed back with a kinetic wave, and Izuku turned around to glare at who stopped them. A masked villain landed nimbly and took off his top hat. Well, aren't you fast? Let me introduce myself. I am Compress with the Vanguard Action Squad of the League of Villains. I have one of my objectives, and you are my other. He moved forward and a blue marble was tossed at Izuku. Izuku saw the marble turn into a boulder, and he shattered it with a concentrated blast of sound energy. He kept track of the villain through his senses as Mina shot acid at him, and Hanta kept Kyuka safe. Leave now, Izuku growled at the villain. No can do, not until dash. He was cut off by Izuku roaring in fury at being stopped from getting Toru to help. A bead of blue-white coalesced in front of Izuku's mouth and liquid fire exploded at the villain. He dodged but was caught in the fire. He yelled in pain and clutched at his now missing elbow. What remained was a charred stump with a blackened bone sticking out. The villain looked in fear at the boy who was looking at him again, and another blinding white bead was forming. Compress saw the willingness to kill in his eyes and ran while clutching his arm. He threw whatever he could behind him as he ran as fast as he could. With the villain gone, Izuku turned back to his friends and they nodded at him and they got moving again. They ran into others from his class and 1B as they made it back to camp. Many students were back and prepared to help wherever they could. Izuku got Toru back to safety with no shoes and a missing shirt. His scars were very clear for everyone to see as Izuku found a place to set Toru down. He was still frustrated at the helplessness as he looked down at Toru's unmoving form. Many other students were in a similar situation as they were unconscious. The remaining group of friends gathered around Izuku hovering over Toru's form and Jairu near her. Mina held Izuku's shoulder as they couldn't do anything to help. All they could do is wait for help. Izuku looked out into the forest and he could still see the blue glow from the fire. He had to do something to keep his mind off of the unmoving girl and he got up. Izuku, where are you going? Mina asked worriedly. Izuku waved her concerns away and ignored the question from Aizawa again as his body was covered in the void. He blasted off and rocketed toward the fire. He focuses his anger on speeding up and he arrived over the blazing fire. He could see police and ambulances on the road headed to the camp. He dove down to the fire and landed in the center. From above, a news helicopter began to record the fire and the scenery for the news coverage. Everyone in the helicopter focused on the forest fire as a small part was snuffed out. In the center of the snuffed out part was a figure. There was too much smoke to see properly, but they all could see the snuffed out section expand outwards. Like a hurricane of fire, it was all sucked into one spot. As more was pulled into the figure, more ice covered where they stood. What was left was ash as the raging fire was taken into someone in the center of the storm. When the fire department and water heroes arrived where the fire should have been, instead, they found a barren frozen wasteland with nothing but ash contained in it. Not a single burned tree or shrub remained, only ash. Izuku returned to camp with more thermal energy than he could imagine, but he couldn't celebrate. He arrived just as the ambulances got to the camp and the police followed behind. He rejoined his gang of friends and Mina gave him a brief hug of relief. Denki and Hanta both had similar expressions to her. Paramedics began to run around and load the unconscious students onto the vehicles. Izuku wanted to go with Toru, but he couldn't do anything other than get in the way. So he let her and Jairu get loaded onto the back of an ambulance and drive off. Mina pulled Izuku to an area where medics were checking over non-critical injuries. He just now noticed how his classmates were acting. Mina caught his eyes. Bakugo is missing. Dead or kidnapped? Kidnapped. Todoroki was with him, and he was sucked into a marble by a villain. I already told Aizawa we fought the guy, or at least you did. Mina explained. Izuku gave a hum in response. You don't care that he's missing? Him? No. Izuku shook his head. She quirked the corner of her mouth up at that and leaned closer. I don't either, she whispered. Izuku smiled for once since everything started. He just hopes Toru will be all right. He sat down in front of a paramedic and was checked over by them. They checked his head for injuries and asked questions. He could see their eyes wandering up at his chest and back where his scars lay, but they didn't ask. Once everyone was checked over, they were loaded up on the bus and headed out to the hospital to get healed and get reports given out. He was given a shirt and sandals by Yairuzo, and he thanked her for her thoughtfulness. Chapter 26. Healing. Classes 1A and 1B were funneled into the same hospital for healing. Many of those in 1B were affected by the mist since they were deeper in the forest waiting for the test of courage. 1A mostly had minor injuries, the worst being Shoji losing one of his hands, but he said it would grow back. Izuku was the most banged up with his bruises and cuts from the branches. The only ones in 1A who were affected by the mist were Toru, Kyuka, and Yairuzo to a lesser extent. His mind went back to Toru's limp body on the forest ground next to Kyuka. Anger boiled at the situation. Once again, they were targeted by the League of Villains on a school trip. The first time was mostly due to them targeting All Might and him not being at the USJ. They had broken into UA and gotten the schedule. But now, it couldn't be a coincidence that they happened to know where the training camp was. Eraserhead even said it was secluded, and no one would have been told until they arrived for their safety. So much for that. Their mission was for him and Bakugo to be kidnapped. He was brought out of his thoughts as the doctor saw him finish up his healing. This was one of the first times he was healed by a doctor and the first time in a hospital. His bruises were just about gone, but his cuts were to heal naturally. He thanked the doctor and headed out to find the attending nurse. He asked about Toru and was directed to a room but wasn't allowed to go in since doctors were examining her and Kyuka for the effects of the mist. He found a small waiting area near her room and his friends were already there. Mina, Denki, and Hanta sat in quiet as they were lost in thought. Izuku didn't speak up and sat next to them. Mina looked at who sat next to her and gave him a small smile. How are you doing? Mina asked. The other two turned to Izuku as well. Izuku sighed and rubbed his forehead. Angry that we were attacked in a supposedly secluded camp and worried. There is nothing he can do to help Toru except to wait. Mina nodded. She sniffed and wiped her eyes. Yeah, me too. Her voice wobbled. Izuku put an arm around her shoulder, and she cried into his. Denki gritted his teeth and clenched his fists, feeling similar to Izuku. Hanta showed no exterior emotions but was in the same boat as them. A few minutes later, they were brought out of their thoughts by the door to Toru's and Kyuka's room opening, and two doctors walked out. The gang of friends jumped them and began to ask questions. Will they be all right? What did that mist do to them? Mina was the first to speak for them all. The doctors backed away slightly at the suddenness but composed themselves at a familiar situation. The older one spoke. We drew blood and had a toxicology test on them both. It was a sleeping agent who knocked them out. It will have to run its course until they wake up. How long will it take? A week at most, a few days at least. He answered before they could ask. Can we go in? Izuku asked. The younger doctor looked at them and asked, You are part of her class? They nodded and she gave a small smile. Please be quiet. And she waved them at the door. They gave their thanks and moved past them into the room. Denki opened the door and they funneled into the room. Izuku stared at Toru in a hospital gown, covered in hospital bed sheets. She looked as if she was sleeping and looking at Kyuka. She was the same. Hanta pulled an extra chair from the corner of the room and set it next to the other two. Mina pulled Izuku to a chair, and he sat next to Toru's bed. They didn't say anything and just stayed close to their friends. Have you guys told your parents yet? Denki broke the silence of the room. With what phone, dummy?
Mina snorted softly.
Right, I forgot. Denki chucked, self-deprecating. I'm sure the school has already taken care of that. I'm curious, though, how they will find us. Hanta said with reason. They all shrugged and began to trade stories from their time apart at the camp. They didn't have much to tell. They were on the trail, and then they noticed the blue glow of the fire and figured out something was wrong. When they heard an explosion go off by Bakugo and a glacier of ice followed it, they knew they were under attack. They backtracked and got lost for a bit until they found Izuku and the others. Denki, for his part, helped out Tokoyami and Dark Shadow when the Quirk went feral when Shoji got hurt. His lightning was enough for Dark Shadow to calm down, but he was drained of electricity. Izuku told them his side of the story by having to decide whether to go for Koda or Toru. His fight with Muscular and the state he left him after getting Koda to safety. Then, I'm looking for Toru and Kyuka while helping Uraraka and Tsuyu on the way. And then finally finding them. You did the right thing, Izuku. If you went after Toru and left Koda, Muscular would most likely have killed him. Toru and Kyuka are both trained to be heroes. They aren't defenseless. You helped with that, and they are all right, just sleeping is all. Mina reassured Izuku, churning thoughts. She's right. You did what was right. You saved the civilian and trusted the others to take care of themselves. That's something we learned. Denki added to Mina, and Hanta nodded along with him. I suppose you're right. I just hate seeing them like that. Izuku waved at the two. We all do, Mina said. They stayed quiet for a moment, and a few minutes later, Aizawa peeked through the door and opened it when he saw them. He checked over them all and then the two in beds. He turned back to the others. Your families are downstairs. He looked at Mina, Denki, and Hanta. He turned to Izuku. We haven't been able to reach yours. Any way to contact them? They all looked at Izuku, and he shook his head. No, I'll be staying here for a bit longer, he said truthfully. His friends gave him worried looks, but Izuku shook his head, and they let it be for now. Aizawa, on the other hand, stared at Izuku with an unreadable expression. Izuku turned to his friends. You should all get going. They will be worried for you all. Mina got up and pulled him into a hug before stepping away. Denki and Hanta both gave him waves, and they made their way downstairs with worried expressions about Izuku and what relationship he had with his family. Aizawa escorted them downstairs and left Izuku alone in the room with the two. Later, Izuku was lost in thought. Aizawa came back with the bag he packed to go camping. He took it and nodded in thanks. We need to contact your family. I'll be fine. I'll be staying here for a bit longer. Izuku sat down again and took his phone out and pocketed it. He turned to glare at Aizawa. How were they able to find us? I thought it was supposed to be a secluded site, he questioned. Aizawa saw the deflection but went with it. We don't know. He shook his head. Once is a coincidence. Twice is a pattern. The League knew where the staff room was for the schedule, and now they knew where we were at. He left the implications unsaid. Aizawa sent a sharp look at the boy before him. Those are dangerous words. Did any staff know the location? Izuku tilted his head and kept going, keeping his voice even. If not, then who else would know? Pointing fingers will end badly if there is no concrete proof, Aizawa said equally even. Next are the students. We arrive at the camp and they let them know where, or bring a tracker on their person. That's enough. Will it be enough when another attack happens and someone dies instead of that shit stain getting kidnapped? Izuku growled out. Aizawa was interrupted from answering by two adults rushing to Toru's bed. The parents of the invisible girl looked over their child in bed with some worry and anger. They didn't notice the other two standing in the room until the man looked up. The woman had almost neon yellow curly hair and the same color eyes. She stood a bit over Izuku's height of 5 feet 5 inches and was slim. The man had dirty blonde hair pulled back that was coming undone. The color reminded him of Bakugo. He stood over 6 feet tall and was broad-shouldered. Who are you? The father asked. The woman looked up with tears in her eyes at the two. Izuku sheepishly lowered his hand. He aimed at them when he was startled at the sudden intrusion. I'm Izuku Midoriya. He bowed slightly in greeting. Aizawa Shota, their homeroom teacher. Aizawa introduced himself. Izuku, Toru spoke much about you, the woman said, wiping tears away and looking him up and down. She turned back to her daughter in bed. I only wish we met in better circumstances. What happened? I thought she was supposed to be safe at that camp. The man turned to Aizawa with anger in his eyes. We do not know how they found the location of the camp. No one but the staff on site was to know the location and Nizu, he explained. At the corner of his eye, he could see Izuku giving him the same glare at him. If you excuse me, he made to leave and no one stopped him. Izuku awkwardly stood there as the two parents of his girlfriend turned to him. Can you tell us what happened? The mother asked. Izuku nodded and told them what happened during the attack. He explained the test of courage and then the fire. He went on to tell them how he found her and how they made it back to camp. I'm sorry I couldn't do anything more, he said. The man sighed and sat in one of the chairs. You did what you could, lad. We were already told about the effects, but seeing her like this. He shook his head, and Izuku agreed. I'm sorry. My name is Nagai, and my husband is Makoto. It's been a day, and by the sounds of it, you have two. Nagai introduced the two. Izuku gave a faint smile in greeting and then stood up to leave. I'll leave you two for some privacy. He bowed slightly and turned to leave. Hold on. Nagai stopped him and pulled him into a tight hug. Thank you for being there for Toru. We'll speak again in better circumstances. She pulled him arm's length away and held his shoulders with a teary smile. Makoto nodded and gave him a faint smile as well. Izuku's throat closed up, and he cleared it. I'd like that. He smiled a bit and gave one last look at Toru's sleeping face and left with his bag. Izuku left the hospital in the early morning and made his way to the train station. He boarded it alone with no one around. He arrived at the apartment around 3 a.m. The first thing he did was take a shower. When he was done, he saw that he had multiple messages from the chat room saying the others were home and to let them know when he was home as well. He smiled a bit at that and sent a message to confirm his safety. After cooking up some breakfast, he went to bed and into a fitful sleep. Izuku woke up late. It was a bit afternoon and he was still tired. He got up anyway and showered again to rinse off the sweat from his body. He sat in the living room with nothing to do. His mind kept going back to Toru even though he knew she was as safe as she could be. The hospital they were taken to was frequented by heroes and high-profile people. The security would be higher than most. But Yue was supposed to be the same. With that, he packed a bag and some things to distract himself and headed back to the hospital. He had nothing better to do, and there was nothing left for him at the apartment. He sent a message to the chat room that he was headed over to visit Toru. The train ride was filled with conversations about the attack at the camp. Izuku did his best to ignore it, but it was hard with screens showing news coverage of the incident. They even showed a clip of him absorbing the forest fire from above. He had to admit it looked pretty cool. Toru was the same as she was the night before. Her parents weren't in the room. The only other person inside was Kyuka in her bed. Izuku sat down on the small couch against the wall facing the two beds and settled in. He pulled out a book to read, but it was hard to concentrate, and he had to reread passages multiple times. Hours passed, and he got sick of trying to read. Instead, he pulled out the sketchbook he was planning to gift Toru. He still had a few more pictures he could copy over and draw Toru into them. So, that's what he distracted himself with until Denki, Mina, and Hanta joined him in the room. Mina and Hanta pulled up chairs, and Denki sat next to Izuku on the couch. They chatted quietly as time passed on. All their parents were unsure to leave them out of their eyesight, but they managed to convince each one of them. When they got hungry, two split off and brought back takeout for the others. It was a difficult time for all of them. Another day passed the same way until all of 1A showed up at Toru's and Kyuka's door. Izuku was the first to speak. What's going on? He asked with a furrowed brow. Kirishima was about to speak when Todoroki stopped him and nodded to the girls sleeping. Right, we want to talk. Kirishima jerked his head for them to follow. They did so, and the rest of the class joined them in an empty hospital room. What's this about? Mina asked, and many of their class were also curious. I think we can help Bakugo. Yairuzo put a tracker on the Nomu that was at the camp with someone from 1B's help. If we ask Yairuzo to make us another device to find the tracker as she gave to the heroes, then we can save him from whatever they are doing to him," he said with passion. Izuku scowled at the mere mention of Bakugo, and more so when they were having a meeting to go rescue him. Most of the class was shocked at the idea of going out and essentially committing vigilantism. His gang of friends frowned as well at Kirishima's idea. Izuku turned to leave. "Midoriya, where are you going?" Kirishima called out to stop him. "I'm leaving, but you've known Bakugo the longest. Don't you want to help him?" he pleaded. Izuku whipped around with fury in his eyes. Kirishima took a step back, seeing the look on his face. "Why would I want to help him? Let me ask you all a question. How many of you figured out why I loathe Bakugo?" He turned to everyone else and most shook their heads or looked confused. Tsuyu spoke up. "I have an idea, and I hope I'm wrong. If it's true, then I will have to question Yue's reasoning." "You're right, Kirishima. I've known him for 10 years. Let me tell you a story. Once, there were two boys. They were best of friends, brothers almost, until one got a powerful quirk, and the other was deemed quirkless. The boy with the powerful quirk was praised and praised that he could no wrong, while the other boy was shoved down and beaten for being weak. The powerful quirk user began to have fun with his quirk and used it everywhere, and especially on his old friend. For 10 years that continued as the quirkless boy was ignored and beaten by everyone while the powerful boy could do whatever he wanted. He had a powerful quirk after all. Until one day the quirkless boy got a quirk, and boy did he contemplate some horrible things to use it for. Instead, he trained it as best he could to try to catch up with the rest, and instead turned in all the evidence the boy collected to the police. The school was shut down and the powerful boy was arrested. The once quirkless boy managed to win, but he was covered in scars and distrustful. He was hoping to live the rest of his life without ever seeing the other boy again. The boy was happy not to have to see the other who burned him daily. Until the first day of school. Do you want to guess who the two boys are? Izuku glared at the redhead, who looked sick to the core. The rest of the class wasn't doing much better. "I was wrong. It was worse," Sue croaked sadly. "So, no, I don't want to go rescue Bakugo. He can go rot." Izuku sneered at the idea. "You are lying. Bakugo is brash and rude at times, but he isn't like that. Yue wouldn't allow him to join the hero course." Ida stepped forward and challenged Izuku. "Like you should be talking, you're still here." Izuku shot back. "What's that supposed to mean?" Uraraka asked shakily. "Don't you dare." Ida stepped forward aggressively. "Anyone with enough power can get away with anything. Isn't that right?" He looked over at Todoroki, and he looked away. Ida's fist landed on Izuku's face but didn't do any damage. Izuku's eyes turned to Ida's furious ones. There were shouts of alarm from the others at the sudden attack from one of their own. Ida was pushed back, and Izuku lowered his hand from where it was on Ida's chest. He had released enough kinetic energy to shove the bespectacled boy to the ground. Mina, Denki, and Hanta stepped close to Izuku, ready to back him up. "I want nothing to do with Bakugo. Do what you want." Izuku turned and walked out of the room with Ida's glare on the back of his head. The other three followed their gang leader out of the room. Just about everyone left in the room was conflicted about what was revealed. Todoroki wanted to go after Bakugo. He was kidnapped right under his eyes and felt guilty. But after hearing the truth of who Bakugo was and how similar he was to Endeavor, he was conflicted. Kirishima was close friends with Bakugo and learned what he did shifted his views. Tokoyami and Tsuyu were the first to walk out of the room. "Wait, what about the plan?" Kirishima called out to them. Tsuyu stopped and looked back at everyone. "Midoriya was right. I want nothing to do with this. And I hope you don't do anything foolish." Tokoyami nodded, and they both left. Soon, the class began to disperse after being given the revelation of both why Izuku was the way he was, Bakugo's history, and their connection to each other. The plan Kirishima was building fell apart before it could see the field. Chapter 27. Revealed. Izuku watched the news on the TV in Turu's and Kyuka's room. Currently, All Might was battling against some villain in the Kamino ward. The same ward where Bakugo was, and the League was trying to capture him again. The raid to rescue Bakugo began while Yue gave a formal apology to everyone and made a statement. Bakugo was trying to escape from being encircled by the League. It was evident on the news helicopter the villains Izuku encountered were still seriously hurt. The girl was stumbling and sluggish while the top hat villain was down one arm, and if his quirk was based around his hands, half effectiveness. The villain All Might was fighting was strong. He was holding his own against the number one hero. From what Izuku could tell, the villain had used different quirks. He could see when the villain's arm grew and then metal bolts grew out afterwards. Those two could have been connected, but when he forced Kurogiri to activate his quirk while unconscious, Izuku was sure that was the man who gave the quirks to the Nomu. Izuku frantically wrote down his theories about having multiple quirks. What could that mean for quirks? Were they part of a person or some attachment has grown on? Did the villain have a limit on the number of quirks he could hold? How many could he use at the same time? The mere idea of that kind of quirk fascinated Izuku to no end, and he was happy to have something to research. He turned back to the TV where Bakugo apparently blasted off the ground into MT Lady's hand, and then she threw him like a rat. He barked out a laugh at the scene of Bakugo cartwheeling in the air. All Might had seen his student evacuate the area and began to unleash his full power against the villain. The camera couldn't pick up what the villain was saying, but it affected the number one hero. Some world-changing revelation shook All Might, and his true form was shown to all of the world. But to his credit, All Might didn't give up and finished off the villain with an earth-shattering punch. There All Might stood emaciated and unsteady on his feet. He was about to say something, but Izuku turned off the TV. He didn't care for the man. Izuku returned to playing with the idea of multiple quirks in a body. It was clear to Izuku that he wasn't working alone to create the Nomu. They had a humanoid appearance and were altered either by a quirk or science. Could adding too many quirks in a normal human transform them into Nomu, or was there a different process? So many questions and no way to answer them at the moment. Izuku responded to some messages in the group chat from his friends about the news. He went back to his notebook and kept going on theories and fun scenarios with multiple quirks. Another day passed with Izuku spending most of his time at the hospital with Toru and Kyuka. The other members of his gang joined him every once in a while, but they didn't stay longer than he did. On the fourth day after the camp, Izuku was detailing a picture for Toru when he heard a noise come from her. Izuku dropped what he was doing and went to her side. "Toru?" Izuku asked, next to her bed. She groaned and she smiled softly at hearing Izuku's voice. "Suku," she hummed. "Toru?" Izuku asked gently and took her hand in his. His voice wavered, but he stayed near her. "Doing in my room?" she mumbled. Izuku laughed and remembered to call the doctor. He pushed the button and went back to Toru's side. "Not in your room, Toru." "No, I'm right." Toru raised her hand and placed it over Izuku's face. Izuku took Toru's hand and held it close to his face. A nurse ran inside with a doctor on her heels. "When did she wake?" the nurse asked and began to check her pulse and other simple tests while putting on goggles to see Toru. "Not 2 minutes ago," Izuku responded but stayed near her. "And Miss Jairu?" the doctor asked without looking up. Izuku looked over at her. "Nothing yet." He sighed. "Don't worry, lad. Miss Hagakure's awakening is a good sign for the others as well," the doctor said as Toru began to regain her senses. The medical professionals backed away to take note of their results, and Izuku got close. "Izuku, we're at the hospital. What happened?" she asked groggily. "The League of Villains attacked the camp and you were knocked unconscious by a mist. Do you remember that?" Izuku spoke slowly. She began to wake more and more as the seconds ticked by. "Yeah, I remember seeing a mist and running away, but we got drowsy and that's it." Kyuka, in the bed 5 feet away. "Everyone is all right, small injuries here and there," Izuku explained. "No one was hurt?" She pushed herself to sit up and Izuku helped her. "Bakugo was kidnapped and then rescued." Izuku shrugged. She blew a raspberry. "Fuck Bakugo." Izuku glanced over to see the doctor and nurse stop at that and look over. Izuku bit his lip from laughing. "The doctors are still in the room." "Oh!" Heat bloomed on her face and Izuku laughed and pulled her into a hug. "This is nice. I'm so happy you're okay." Izuku sniffed. Toru held Izuku back. "How long has it been?" "For days, they were long days." Izuku pulled back and smiled. The doctor approached and Izuku stepped away to let them work. Toru answered questions that were asked and to see if she had any mental issues with the mist. Izuku sent a message to the group chat that Toru was awake, and it exploded into chatter and frantic back and forward. Toru's parents were notified as well, before any of Izuku's friends or Toru's parents could show up. Kyuka stirred awake similarly to Toru. Izuku did the whole process again, and the same two came in from earlier and went to Kyuka. She was confused and groggy but began to gain awareness just as Toru did. When the doctors left after confirming Kyuka was well, Izuku sat between the two to fill them in on what they missed in the 4 days. Izuku sensed 3 familiar sources of energy getting close fast. Finished telling them the recap of the week when the gang of friends burst through the door and surprised the other two. Izuku watched Mina envelop Toru in a hug and then Kyuka quickly after. The other two were also ecstatic to see them healthy. Makoto and Nagai slammed the door open, startling everyone including Izuku, who had to lower his hand again. The two shouted in joy and rushed to Toru's bedside. The others got out of their way and moved to Kyuka's side of the room to give them some privacy. After a bit of time, Toru called them to open the curtain separating the room. Mina peeked her head and pulled the curtain back. "Heya, nice to meet you, you must be her parents." Mina introduced herself with a beaming smile. The others followed suit by introducing themselves. Last was Izuku, who waved with a small smile. Toru waved him closer and he began to get nervous. Izuku stepped next to Toru's bed and introduced Izuku. "And this is Izuku, my boyfriend," she said with a smile. Izuku gave a small smile and nodded. Nagai gave him a reassuring smile, but Makoto watched him with a close eye and scanned him up and down. "He doesn't seem too impressive," the man said. "Dad, Makoto." Both the women admonished him. They were drawn to Mina, who barked out a laugh and covered her mouth quickly. Sorry, but Izuku is terrifying." She pointed at him and moved closer. "He is a bit short, but he is built different. Not swole, but beefy. I'm not some prize bull you are selling." Izuku scoffed and pulled his arm away from Mina, showing him off. Toru was giggling on the bed as her parents watched the display. "He's terrifying?" Makoto asked. "Your quirk then, and brains. He helped us all with our quirks and improving how we use them." Mina nodded. "Izuku was the one who showed me to use my quirk as a focused mirror instead of just invisibility." Toru added. "You can protect my daughter then?" Makoto asked. "I will do everything in my power to do so. But she isn't some damsel in distress. We're all training to be heroes, including her." Izuku said with all seriousness. "He's right. I don't need him watching over my shoulder. I can take care of myself," Toru said and took Izuku's hand. Makoto was about to open his mouth again, but Nagai stopped him. "I'm happy to meet Toru's friends finally." She gave them all a warm smile and Izuku a nod. They chatted for a bit longer, then one by one the others had to head home when their parents called them home. Izuku was left with the Hagakures, but also thought of leaving them to have more proper privacy. Before leaving, Izuku grabbed his sketchbook and presented it to Toru. She looked surprised and gently took it. "What's this?" Toru asked, and her parents watched in silence. "A gift, something I've been working on for a bit. I'll add to it when there is to add." Izuku smiled and motioned her to look inside. Toru gasped and her parents peeked to see what surprised her. They stood up and moved to see properly when they caught a glimpse of what it was. A front portrait of Toru with incredible detail. It was just black and white, but the detail of each curling hair and each eye was perfect. Izuku felt pride at having his work admired. "Green," Kyuka whispered and waved him over. "What is it?" "I like to draw, so I drew Toru." He smiled. "That's pretty sweet," she said with a soft smile. "Izuku, this is amazing. Better than the one you gave me." Toru pulled Izuku to her. "The first one was a bit rushed since I wanted you to have it. These I took my time." Izuku motioned to the sketchbook. "It's amazing. Thank you." Toru pulled Izuku into a hug and he reciprocated. He enjoyed the warmth that she filled him with. They pulled away and Izuku motioned to the sketchbook. "That was just the first one." Toru understood immediately and grabbed it and flipped to the next page. It was a copy of their picture taken together in the clearing. Toru was next to Izuku with the others around the two. Instead of her floating clothes cueing in who was there, Toru's head was drawn in with any exposed skin as well. "This is incredible," Nagai admired. She looked up at Izuku. Thank you for this. She smiled. Makoto gave him a grudging nod. Izuku felt more pride fill him. He gave Toru a farewell hug and she gave him a quick peck on the cheek. He left the hospital just as a woman with hair similar to Kyuka and the same earlobes rushed into the hospital with a shaggy-looking man close behind her. Izuku smiled at seeing them hurry along. He arrived at the apartment and cooked up something to eat and sat to read. He felt more relaxed than he did in a while. That relaxation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Izuku sensed the two heat sources and moved behind the door. The peephole showed Aizawa and All Might standing outside. Izuku scowled slightly and opened the door. Why are you here? Izuku asked without waiting. Your parents should have gotten a call and email from UA about what was going on, Aizawa said, looking behind Izuku to the interior of the apartment. And you? Izuku turned to All Might in his emaciated form. I have some things to say, but first may we come inside to speak. Izuku sighed and opened the door for them and got out of the way. He waved them to the living room and went to the kitchen to brew up some coffee and tea. Even if he doesn't like All Might and is distrustful of Aizawa, he will be a good host. The pot of water was boiling in a moment with an application of thermal energy, and he brought the tray over to the coffee table. He motioned them to have whatever and sat down. Aizawa took a cup of coffee and All Might just a cup of water. Izuku waited for them to start speaking. Aizawa glanced around the living room and its state. It was clean, but he noticed there were no pictures. It was lived in, but he wouldn't be able to tell by who. All Might, for his part, sat awkwardly as Izuku stared at the two. When will your mother be home? Aizawa asked, setting the cup of coffee down. Why? What did UA send out? Izuku leaned back. It's better to discuss this with her present. All Might added. Izuku stared at the two and let out a sigh. He got up and went to the junk drawer. The other two watched him curiously, and then Izuku came back and tossed the post-it note on the coffee table. He waved for them to look. Aizawa picked it up and read what was on it. What is this? He asked with a sinking feeling. Izuku shrugged. She's gone. Left for greener pastures, I don't know. What? What do you mean she left? All Might looked alarmed. Oh, sorry, let me explain. So when I walked into the apartment, that note was on the counter and all her stuff was gone. He said sarcastically. When was this? When was the last time you saw and spoke to her? Aizawa furrowed his brow. I found the note the day after the internships were over. Last time I saw her was over a year ago. Last time I spoke to her, I don't know. That was months ago. Why didn't you say anything? Aizawa asked seriously. What for? She paid for the apartment for the next 3 years and I get funds put into my account every week for necessities. What's different between now and before UA? Nothing. Izuku scowled at Aizawa. She neglected you, that isn't right. All Might said softly. Izuku whipped his head to him. A lot of things aren't fucking right, but I'm luckier than most. Tell me, do you know what the average quirkless person's lifespan is? It's 20. You either die from getting beaten to death, starved with no way to make money, or kill yourself. That's not to mention the ones who go missing, from being sold off to just plain old kidnapping. I was fortunate enough to have a roof over my head and food in my stomach. Why would I ask for more from Inko? He said with cold fury at his circumstances. I am fortunate enough that she left me with everything I needed to take care of myself. He sat back after his rant. They were quiet for a moment as Izuku collected himself. Why are you here? He asked calmly. UA is putting in a dorm system and it's required for 1A and 1B to live there for their safety, Aizawa explained steadily. His mind spun around what his student had said. Safety. Izuku scoffed and sighed. Right then, I'll start packing. He had no reason to leave UA. His friends are there and it furthers his goals. There's still much we need to discuss. More so with your situation. All Might said. Go on then. Muscular, what did you do to him? Aizawa asked. I absorbed his electric energy from his nervous system to stop him from killing Koda. Izuku waited to see the results of his theory. He is brain dead, Aizawa said and watched Izuku carefully. Izuku nodded. It was a possibility. Either doing so would have caused his body to go limp and shut down for a moment and then recover or cause brain death. He hummed. This is a serious matter, Aizawa said harshly. Of course it is. But I'm not getting arrested, otherwise you would have done so already or been kicked out of UA because you were talking about the dorms. Izuku said logically. You essentially killed a man. All Might furrowed his brows. So have you? That wound you have on your side was made by the man with multiple quirks, and you said you ended him. How do you know of him? All Might began to stand. I stopped a monster who was going to kill a child. He was no different from a Nomu except he could think and talk. Izuku ignored All Might's aggressive response. As for how I know of that villain, the fucking news, I saw it with my own eyes. He made a face as if he was asking, are you serious? Back to the topic at hand. Aizawa stopped them from keep arguing. That isn't something you should decide until you are a professional. Izuku nodded sagely. Of course, if only there was a safe place to train and learn without having to fight for our lives. He mocked. Aizawa pursed his lips at the jab. Is there something else we need to speak about, or are we done? All Might sighed and stood up with the intent to bow. I am sorry for the grief I've caused you in the past or present. If there is anything to repay you, please just ask. Izuku stared at the number 1 hero bowing to him. Anything? Expel Bakugo Katsuki and have his red-tapped file opened. He said casually. All Might straightened and made a face. I cannot do that. Then get out. Send the information about the dorms to me, and I'll be ready to go. He said, already knowing what his answer would be. Aizawa handed Izuku a packet of papers about the dorm system and got up. He wanted to say something to the boy, but the look Izuku gave him stopped him. All Might walked out with a grimace but said nothing. Izuku walked them to the door and closed it softly behind them. With a sigh, he cleaned up after the two and began to pack what he would need for the dorms. He read through the packet of information and it was pretty straightforward. What the school would provide and what the rooms would have. Izuku rubbed his face at the complications that will rise from letting UA know more about him. Chapter 28. Peace. Izuku began packing his meager belongings. He didn't have much that fit into 3 cardboard boxes. He would have to buy more things for the new dorms. Like the shoes, he exploded in the rush to save Kota and Toru. With an annoyed sigh, he put on the old pair of shoes he had and went out to buy a new pair. A few days later, Izuku walked through the gates of the school and stood in front of the new dorms. Most of his classmates were already there and waiting. Toru skipped over to him and latched onto his arm. She gave him a beaming smile and Izuku returned it. You would never believe how much I had to argue for my parents to let me stay at UA. She began and led Izuku to their gang of friends. Makes sense, if I had a kid coming here, I would have pulled them out. Izuku argued. But I'm glad you succeeded in talking them in. What's this about a kid? Toru. Before wedlock. For shame. Mina teased. Izuku reddened at the idea but didn't push away the thought of having a child with Toru. He reddened even more at the realization. Ha! He looks like a strawberry. Denki laughed. I'm sure Toru is just as bad, but she's cheating with her quirk. Denki turned to the invisible girl and was blinded by a bright light. My eyes! Ha! Hanta laughed and pointed. Hyuka shook her head at all of them. I swear we are going to end up killing one another. Denki will be first, of course. The chatter died down and Izuku turned to see why. Bakugo and Aizawa walked to the group together. Bakugo looked calm, but the tension in his shoulder showed otherwise. The class was visibly unsure of what to think of their classmate and the two noticed. Aizawa stopped and scanned them. Everyone is here. Good. Let's get the tour over with already. Aizawa walked ahead and through the doors. Izuku saw Kirishima try to make conversation with Bakugo, but it was forced on the redhead's end. The rest of the class was never close to Bakugo, and what Izuku told them about him made it worse. Currently, Bakugo and Kirishima were separated from everyone, and Kirishima seems to be losing his ambition to stay close to the bomber. The tour wasn't very exciting, but it was new for everyone to see. Soon, Aizawa left and everyone went to their rooms to get settled in. Izuku was done in a couple of hours and headed down to eat. He was slightly uncomfortable sharing space with others since Izuku had been alone for over 5 years at least. He found bread, sandwich meat, and cheese. With that, he settled in for his meal. Some of his classmates had the same idea and began to scout out the kitchen for food.
Midoriya?
Could I grab the bread from you? Uraraka asked with a small smile. Izuku nodded and slid the bread over to her. He absent-mindedly watched her make a peanut and jelly sandwich with little of each. You ever try adding honey to it? Izuku tried to converse. Uraraka gave a bright smile. Mom sometimes made it like that, but... She trailed off. Honey is expensive. Izuku nodded. He recalled trying it once and loving it, but the budget for extra things like that was scarce. Uraraka looked up at that and nodded. Your family was tight on money too? She went back to her sandwich. Something like that. Izuku shrugged non-committally. He got up to walk away and wander around when she called out. Midoriya, I just wanted to let you know that I don't care that you were quirkless. Yeah. She finished sheepishly. Izuku turned around to see the honesty, and that warmed his chest. Thanks, Uraraka. That means a lot to me. He gave her a grateful smile. Of course. She beamed and munched on her PB&J sandwich. Denki finished and met Izuku in the common room.
Yo.
Finished already? He plopped next to Izuku on the couch. MHM? Comfy. I don't have much. Izuku shrugged. Denki looked at his friend in worry. Are you all right? You drop things like that every once in a while. Izuku opened his mouth to brush it off but closed it. Yeah, there's something I should probably tell you guys. Maybe a while ago. He saw more worry show on Denki's face. Nothing urgent. Just another thing is all. He tried to reassure him with little success. All right. Denki nodded but still was apprehensive. Toru interrupted them by jumping over the backrest and almost landing on Izuku. What you guys talking about? She smiled up at Izuku. I'll tell you later. Izuku smiled and hugged Toru. Making me jealous over here, Denki grumbled. They ignored him and spent the rest of the day hanging out in their new environment. Denki and Hanta hooked up their gaming systems for the class and fought over games. Most of the class soon joined them in the common room to watch and participate in the gaming tournament. Izuku sat next to Toru the whole time and she leaned into his shoulder. Overall, it was a pleasant time. Before bed, Denki stopped the rest of the gang and motioned to Izuku. Right? Izuku got up and made them follow him into his room. Izuku welcomed them in without any hesitation. Is something the matter? Toru asked worriedly. Not really. Everyone stood around and waited. Izuku sighed and rubbed his shoulder. You all know about how I was treated and all that. Well, my mother was the opposite and left me to deal with it all alone. To get it out. I haven't seen her in over a year and haven't spoken to her in more. What? Mina exclaimed in horror. And after the internships, I found out she moved out of the apartment and paid it for the next 3 years. He added, Izuku, Toru said sadly and tightly hugged him. Why didn't you say anything? She sobbed into his chest. It's not like it would have changed anything. It's just another thing I had to deal with. Izuku shrugged with his arms around Toru. Denki got close and pulled Izuku's shirt up to show his stomach. You're not starving or anything, right? He poked. Izuku's cheeks reddened and he batted Denki's hand away. No, Inko deposits money into an account for necessities. That's why you knew how to cook so well. Mina chuckled weakly. Man, that blows. Kyuka said sadly. I'm guessing Yue knows since they went to everyone's house for the dorms. Yeah, Aizawa and All Might came. And your dad? Not around. Hanta asked tentatively. Izuku shrugged again. Never met him. Maybe she ran off to find him. He said bitterly. Toru squeezed tighter to reassure him. It helped. Is there anything else that we should know? Just to clear the plate. Denki asked and got a mild glare from Kyuka. Izuku thought for a moment. Not that I can recall. The gang stayed for a bit longer in Izuku's room. Mina was the one who broke the silence. Let's have a sleepover. Izuku has missed out and we don't have school until Monday. She proposed. Toru jumped on the idea. Yeah, that's a great idea. Denki and Hanta both shrugged and nodded. Everyone looked at Kyuka. Well, I can't say no now. Everyone gave a quiet cheer and they filed out of Izuku's room to get supplies. While Izuku wasn't opposed, it would have been considerate of them to ask what he thought. That didn't stop the warm smile that showed on his face. He stayed there for a bit and wondered what he should do to prepare. He didn't know what people did at sleepovers or what they would need. He was brought out of his thoughts when Denki burst in with his arms full of stuff. Izuku rushed over to help him. Soon, the rest of the gang arrived with similarly filled arms, Mina's with more snacks than anything else. They made a large blanket and pillow pile that everyone sat upon. Hanta set up the small TV he brought. Mina passed snacks around and fought Toru when they wanted the same snack. Kyuka caught Izuku's unsure nature. "You'll enjoy it. Just relax," she reassured him. Izuku nodded tentatively. "Have you had sleepovers?" "Only a few times and way long ago. They usually go about the same each time." She chuckled. Everyone got comfortable and Hanta put on a comedy show. Toru snuck under Izuku's arm and snuggled in with a bag of gummy worms. Mina pouted at her lost snack and resigned herself to gummy bears. Izuku looked around at his friends getting under blankets and laughing at the bad jokes on the TV. He looked down at Toru leaning on his chest and felt her giggles. Izuku felt ever grateful that he made friends with the people around him. He held Toru and felt himself relax in his new possible home. Izuku was the first one awake and he was confused at waking up in an unfamiliar place. He sensed the area around him with his quirk and remembered where he was. He looked around at the sleeping forms of his friend splayed around his room. Denki was curled up with his blanket half off his body at the feet of everyone else. Kyuka's leg was on Denki's chest and her arm was under Hanta, who was sleeping face down. Mina was spread eagle and half of her body was draped over Hanta and her legs over Kyuka. Drool dribbled down her cheek to soak the back of Hanta's shirt. Izuku looked at Toru and felt heat rush his face and body. She was curled around his arm and her back was pressed tightly to his chest. Izuku's other arm was hugging her from behind and his legs were wrapped around hers. He was stuck and couldn't move unless he woke her and possibly everyone else. Without much else to do, Izuku relaxed again and slowly dozed off to the smell of Toru's shampoo. "Mina, I think that's enough photos," Kyuka yelled at the pink girl. "They look so cute though." Mina quietly squealed with joy. "Look at Izuku's face, he looks so relaxed. He always looks at least a bit tense and like looking over his shoulder." Hanta noted and the others agreed. "What should we do? Slip out? Wake them, guys? I know it would be pretty obvious to see if Izuku woke, but how do we know if Toru is awake or not?" Denki asked. The four zeroed in on where Toru's face should be and they heard a quiet squeak. Mina slapped her hand over her mouth to keep quiet as she held in the sound of laughter. "Toru, you little seductress you," Mina squealed. "I can't get out without waking him," she said quietly as she could. "Do you want to get out?" Kyuka smirked. They heard Toru grumble and her clothes shifted as everyone awake chuckled. Izuku began to stir awake and the others quickly acted like they were waking up for the first time. Izuku opened his eyes and looked around at everyone in completely different positions than they were earlier. He caught the concealed smirk of Mina's and immediately realized they all saw him. His face burned at being caught in such a situation and the rest of his body got hot too when he sensed Toru trying her best to act asleep as well. "Ah, good morning everyone," Denki said with the most unconvincing yawn. "Yeah, he's not buying it." "Kyuka," she said. Izuku began to pull away from his hold on Toru when he felt her hold tight to his arm and locked her legs to prevent him from moving for a moment longer, and then she let go and got up with him. Toru's hair was sticking up everywhere as she turned to Izuku's burning face. She gave him a warm smile and pecked his cheek. "The best sleep I've had," she whispered to him. Izuku's face burned even hotter, and he tried to hide away his face from the others who began to laugh at his embarrassment. Toru helped calm him down by hugging him from behind and giggling softly as everyone else began to stretch and wake properly. Once Izuku was sufficiently calmed down, everyone headed downstairs to find breakfast. They left the mess in Izuku's room for later. The rest of the weekend passed with the gang of friends hanging around together most of the time. Sometimes they split apart to enjoy their time alone, but the majority was spent doing something everyone could enjoy. Soon, Monday morning came and everyone dragged their feet to class. "I don't wanna," Mina whined for the nth time that morning as they walked through the doors of the classroom. "Me neither," Denki whined next to her. Once everyone sat down, Aizawa came through the door a few moments later. "Go get changed," and he walked out. Izuku rolled his eyes at the man, but did as he was told. Everyone met up in a concrete gym with a few teachers behind Aizawa. He explained what they missed out on since the attack on the camp cut their time short. Izuku thought about super moves he could make but realized most of his moves are super moves. Anytime he absorbs or releases a large amount of energy of any kind changes the battlefield. The combination of absorbing light and sound changes the environment to his advantage since he could still see with his sixth sense. Thermal absorption to the maximum would freeze anything in the immediate vicinity while adding to his core. Those were the two he immediately thought of, and they were game changers. Aizawa was done speaking and everyone began to split off to make super moves. His gang of friends also split off to practice the moves that they already had, thanks to Izuku. He was still curious about Toru and her hidden super move, but he wouldn't pry. Young Midoriya, you seem lost. Do you need any help thinking up any super moves? All Might approached him tentatively. Izuku eyed the man for a moment. Your smashes. They are super moves, right? All Might was a bit surprised that the boy spoke to him without any venom in his tone and was more than happy to help. Yes, even though I use them frequently, they are super moves. Izuku nodded. Then I have plenty of super moves. I did ask Hatsum for some support items. I'll go see if she is done. Izuku turned to leave. Where are you going? Aizawa asked. Shouldn't you be working like the others? He said he had plenty of super moves. All Might shrugged. You're not going anywhere until you show me 3. Izuku rolled his eyes and glared at the man. He was far enough away so they didn't get caught in the crossfire. The immediate area turned into the coldest part of the planet without Izuku moving a muscle and continued to stare at the underground hero. Absolute Zero. He said the name he made up long ago. Next, he raised his hand, and a bead of pure thermal energy coalesced in his palm, turned from bright white to blue. His eyes turned to All Might and the faint burn scars on his forearms from the same super move he made on the spot. Nuclear immolation. Finally, the bead disappeared, and the area turned into a dome of the void, and the sounds stopped working. Izuku could still see and moved quickly behind a tense Aizawa. He released his quirk and sound came again. Void domain. Aizawa turned in a flash to stare at the boy. Izuku stared back for a moment and turned to head to the support department. The two watched Izuku walk out of the room. They both were wary of Midoriya and his mental stability. One bad day and Aizawa wasn't sure if he could contain him. Maybe if he got the jump on Midoriya, but he was doubtful. He turned to watch the rest of his class and saw that the group of friends belonging to Midoriya all had a head start with super moves. Mina was covered in an acid suit and wafted waves of white mist that ate away at the concrete pillars before her. Kaminari was moving faster than a normal person should. Zero had multiple copies of ectoplasm tied together with rapid movements. Jairu was focusing on sending narrowed sound waves that shook the earth. And Hagakure had burnt targets from light beams similar to Aoyama's quirk. Izuku walked to the metal door and opened it. He looked around and found the pink mechanic with a welding hood on and focused on an invention. Izuku walked over to her and absorbed the light around his face to see what she was welding. He was mildly surprised about the amount of light energy he was absorbing, but focused on what she was working on and waited. He had no clue what she carefully worked on, but it was interesting. He could sense power loader eye him, but paid no mind to the teacher. Hatsum finished and took off the hood and handed it to Izuku. He took it without hesitation and spoke. Hatsum, you finished what I asked? MHM? She turned from her work to see who was beside her. Flux, I have. Come and see what you think. She beamed and dragged Izuku over to the corner. Let me present you with a miniature nuclear reactor. She placed her hands on her hips proudly. Izuku grinned in delight and sensed the device the size of a small refrigerator. He could sense the small amount of nuclear material inside with a lot of energy contained in the material. But the best part was the electric energy contained and waiting to be used. He saw a screen seeing it green and turned to the still grinning girl. How much energy can I get from this? A buttload. It's held in standby mode for now until it's ready to use. Otherwise, if it's on all the time, it could. Hatsum made an explosion with her hands. More of a meltdown, but you get the idea. That makes sense. How does it work? Hatsum beamed and uncovered 2 copper rods. Firmly grasp it. Izuku did so and waited. She tapped on the screen and the machine thrummed to life. How much can you absorb at a time? She asked curiously. As much as I need. Izuku smiled excitedly. Hatsum nodded calmly. Then, full power. She yelled in delight, and they heard Power Loader yelp in panic and begin to rush over. Izuku felt a small trickle and then a torrent of electricity shoot up the copper rods. His smile could only be described as unhinged as bolts of electricity tried to escape but was sucked into his arms. When the rods began to heat up at the amount of energy coursing through them, he absorbed the heat. When the reactor began to leak particles of radiation, he diverted their course to himself and took them in gladly. When the cooling system burned away, he took up the job himself. Bit by bit, the energy contained in the nuclear core was drained away and converted into electricity at a staggering rate that caused the machine to begin to fall apart. "Shut it down!" Power Loader yelled. Hatsum rushed to do so, but the screen sparked and shut down. "That's bad."
Flu.
"Shut it off if you can. If not, well, run." She shrugged. Izuku gave out a pained sigh and reluctantly absorbed the nuclear core and any energy that was contained in the machine. The nuclear reactor came to a dead stop and Izuku sighed. He checked inside his core and his sigh turned into a joyful laugh. "That's a lot of energy." He turned to Hatsum and gave her a thumbs up. "Great job, although I think causing it to melt down wasn't part of the design." "No, it wasn't. Full power caused it to degrade much faster than predicted." Hatsum began to tear it apart when Power Loader ran up to her in a hazmat suit and pulled her away and checked the area with a Geiger counter. It never made a sound. Hatsum and Izuku watched him, and then Izuku turned to her. "Got any nuclear I can absorb?" She beamed and pulled out a cardboard box and pointed at it for him. He didn't even look inside, and it was drained of nuclear energy. "I think my trip here was a success. I look forward to seeing what else you make." Izuku left his number for her. She picked it up and stared at the numbers. "What's this? A code? My phone number? In case you need me to absorb any additional energy or if you make something that I could use." Hatsum beamed and stuck her hand out. "Happy doing business." Izuku took it and shook her greasy hand. And that's a wrap for part 4 of What If Deku Had Energy Absorption Quirk. Huge thanks to Big Teddy G3498 for making this series a reality. We couldn't do it without you. And to my legends, you're the driving force behind every video, so if you're loving the series, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more. We've got more incredible content coming your way. So stay tuned and I'll see you in the next one.